When you asked me to deliver this talk for Ray, I was honored but hesitant. Ray and I were friends for over a half a century, but the only time we were in the same place for any protracted period was actually a couple of months in the late 60s in Los Angeles. Nevertheless, over the next 50 years or so, we met whenever possible, kept in touch, discussed science, and I respected Ray's insights and these days miss his company. In any event, Ray was an interesting figure for those who don't know him. He was intelligent, witty, and if I can move this a little, I can read the screen. He had a lot, as we'll see, he had quite a lot of integrity, and he was also ambitious. Um, Interestingly, if I think about him, when I first met him, he was very respectful of authority and hierarchy and very conservative in a traditional sense. And with time, I think he became much more independent and intuitive. At any rate, Ray came to MIT after I had actually finished my doctorate, and I met him a couple of years later, and it was when I was working at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And they still are essentially governed by the universities in America who have atmospheric science departments. And so part of the quid pro quo is staff members at NCAR are encouraged to spend semesters at the participating universities. And I was at UCLA, and Jewel Charney, who is a distinguished professor at MIT, and my predecessor as the Sloan Professor, was also visiting UCLA, which was his alma mater. And he brought along his student, Ray. Uh, Jules' interest at that time was tropical meteorology, and Ray and I both shared that interest. And it was reasonably fruitful, and there was a program from the GARP, Global Atmospheric Research Program, that focused on the tropics. A lot of data was acquired. We learned a lot about how cumulonimbus clouds worked. At any rate, our friendship continued while Ray finished his doctorate in essentially tropical meteorology, returned to Ireland, and there, he was working as head of research and eventually assistant director of the Irish Met Office. And he was dividing his interests between the theoretical studies and the practical issues of forecasting, which are often somewhat different. At any rate, on the left of the screen is a picture of Ray and me at UCLA. Uh, the changes are discernible time. On the right is a picture of Ray, who visited the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and presumably is making some point there. Judy Curry supplied this photo. Anyway, to continue with the lecture, uh, in the 70s, Ray spent a year as a meteorological expert at the Egyptian Meteorological Institute, and another year in Geneva, participating in the World Climate Program of the World Meteorological Organization. I think he found that sort of interesting. 1987, however, for a variety of reasons, Ray returned to the US and was selected to lead the Laboratory for Atmospheres at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. On his way there, he spent a few days with us in Newton, Massachusetts, for continuing to Greenbelt. That's where the Goddard Space Flight Center was located. And he remained at NASA, where he was in charge of the development of their weather forecasting model until 1995. There were details mentioned, I think, when Ray died. He was very much involved in trying to introduce what is called the Lagrangian methods, which essentially followed the fluid rather than interpreting whatever fluid was at a particular point. Had certain advantages. And NASA, of course, was not subject to the same constraints as the Weather Bureau. Um, the reasons they were interested in was simply to see, among other things, how to integrate the data they were obtaining. And again, that's an interesting problem because most forecast models are designed to use radiosonde data, balloon data, surface data, and so on. They're not all that good at assimilating satellite data. And so that was one of their concerns. But at any rate, Ray was involved in that. But in 1995, he returned to Europe. I think he always felt more comfortable in Europe. And he accepted a professorship at the Niels Bohr Institute at the University of Copenhagen. And again, we had opportunities to visit Ray in Copenhagen, and he also, by that time, was spending a lot of time in Paris and visited us there. He had a colleague at Copenhagen, Axel Vin Nielsen, who was a good meteorologist, and he had formerly headed the World Meteorological Organization. He was rather distinguished, had good positions. And Ray initially, I think, didn't question the global warming hypothesis. I think Ray was very much influenced by Axel, who was deeply skeptical of climate alarm narrative. And Ray respected that and realized that there was a lot to that, but he was shocked by the vituperation that Vin Nielsen had to endure because of skepticism. This is almost unique in our field. I mean, that if you question something, you literally were the victim of hate. One of the people who was very strongly attacking Axel Vin Nielsen was a man called Bert Bolin, who was the first chairman of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He was from Sweden. At any rate, here's a picture during the time in Copenhagen. There was a major meeting in Bergen, and there's a picture of Ray there. And on the right is a picture of Ray and his home in Copenhagen. And, it's interesting. I don't think we ever discussed it, but I always had the feeling that Ray would have liked to have had a position leading the WMO, but I think he realized that once his views on climate were skeptical, there was no hope of an appointment to WMO. And I think to Ray's credit, in contrast to a lot of my colleagues, he was not going to compromise his science. In 2004, Ray returned to Ireland, where he was an adjunct professor of meteorology at UCD, and he was able to resume his scientific studies, including very insightful work on climate. He visited us in Paris again, and we visited Ray at Kilmore Cay and Dublin. And I think despite all the attacks on him for being a climate skeptic, he was happy in Ireland, and he had grown to the point where he could treat the attacks with what I would call admirable philosophical dismay. Here's a picture of Ray and Natasha, who visited us in Paris, and there's a picture of Ray at Kilmore Key. Um, there is an interesting issue in climate. And I think people have to realize that the issue arose in politics. And I've written on this, and I won't go over it here, but, you know, in 1970, on the first Earth Day in April of 1970, the environmental movement changed dramatically. New environmental groups arose, and the focus was no longer endangered species or anything like that. It was energy. And the energy sector had one crucial feature, and that was that it involved trillions of dollars. And it shouldn't be surprising that if an issue that involves a physical property, climate, but is completely political in origin, would be completely oblivious to anything that was true about climate. And that leads to a strange situation, which I'll discuss a little, where outfits like Clintel or others, the CO2 Coalition, uh, will start chiseling away at all these absurdities, and almost everything about the issue is wrong, including the narrative itself. Uh, if somebody like Ray, or myself for that matter, or others, is trying to see what's wrong with it, you quickly realize that you have to prioritize your objections. But for laymen, this doesn't much matter. Since everything is wrong, there are a huge number of targets. Trouble with a lot of these targets is they allowed the narrative to remain sort of in place. But at any rate, among all these various errors, Ray and I shared recognition of one particular thing, and that is that although it's not commonly pointed out, the current climate narrative is almost totally focused on the radiative properties of the tropics. And they're relevant, but the extratropics, where most people live, are dominated by hydrodynamic phenomena. And of course, both radiation and hydrodynamics transport heat, but the latter dominates in the extratropics. Now, as is usual in discussing science, there were technical matters where Ray and I disagreed, but I think neither of us believed that science was ever settled. And resolving differences was part of the dynamic of science. It was also part of the pleasure of science. And one misses scientists of our generation or earlier generations who could afford this pleasure. Excuse me a minute. This is not the case for scientists in fields like climate who are currently employed. And I think it pays to remember this, and I've mentioned this to Jim. Essentially, if you're currently employed in meteorology, atmospheric physics, things like that, you have to publish, you have to get grants, and you cannot get them if you're questioning this narrative. Now, I mentioned here this led to a painful situation for retired scientists like Ray was and I am. And the reason is we were both trained in dynamic meteorology. And for those of you familiar with fluid mechanics, you know it's a difficult subject. You may not realize it. Werner Heisenberg's PhD thesis was in hydrodynamic instability, and he often maintained that it was harder than quantum mechanics. But, you know, it is central to a theoretical understanding of weather and climate. And the ability to communicate with Ray about this material is something that I particularly valued. Part of the reason was that, for the post-retirement community of scientists, we're dying. It's been a long time this issue has been around. And almost all the scientists with whom either of us wanted to communicate, if they're still active and they're employed at universities or other institutions, they're subject to the constraints that I just mentioned. And they're certainly not, for the most part, in the organizations doing battle with climate hysteria. I don't mean this as criticism of organizations like the Irish Climate Science Forum or Clintel or the CO2 Coalition or the Global Warming Policy Foundation and others. These organizations have little trouble identifying numerous errors and failures in the narrative of the alarmists and in the policies. Though, as a rule, most people in these organizations don't have to deal with professional pressures. And so there's a certain freedom there, but there's also a lack of familiarity with the subject. In addition, the aims are somewhat different. It's hard for people like Ray was or I am to avoid wanting to actually understand the climate itself rather than simply knocking out the false narrative. This isn't the same as pointing out errors. And given that the climate alarm is basically political rather than scientific, I suppose just, pointing out the errors and trying to get rid of the policy has a certain priority. Um, on the other hand, it isn't a small thing for the scientific understanding of climate to have been set back a couple of generations. I mean, it's a remarkable situation in the modern world to see a science moving backwards. Remedying this will require that currently active scientists be permitted to return to studying science rather than supporting a political narrative. There's a lot to remedy there. At any rate, in this situation, for a long time, I thought, and others like Will Happer, that it would help if the United States government were to engage in a traditional A team, B team exercise, wherein one side would identify the flaws in the current policy and the other would defend current policy. These have been very effective in dealing with national security and other such issues. Um, the problem here, though, would be the audience. And this is a political issue, and one has to convince the public. And there was, by now probably forgotten, but one time rather famous British writer, physicist, and advisor to Churchill, C.P. Snow. And he wrote about essentially two worlds of knowledge where you had scientists on the one hand and the rest on the other. And he pointed out that the ignorance of science on the part of non-scientists including those who are highly educated, precludes their knowing what to make of any such exercise. In my experience, when it comes to climate, this extends to scientists and engineers whose expertise is outside atmospheric physics. Of course, there are important examples of individuals changing their position on climate when exposed to such debates, but many individuals do not because the issues at debate are inaccessible for them. A good example of the former is Steve Koonin, who you guys probably are familiar with. I think he spoke to you. He was a physicist who pretty much accepted the narrative, but wanted to have something like the A team, B team exercise for the American Physical Society. And as a result of that, he changed his position. He didn't become somebody who was an expert in climate physics, nor did he pretend to be, but he realized that both sides that he invited agreed that this was not an existential threat and that the data didn't support it. And oddly enough, and this is one of the great surprises to me, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its Working Group 1 report, which is the only part that is science, never speaks of an existential threat. And as a number of us noted, all it does is say that, this will be costly and it may, by 2100, reduce the GDP by gross domestic product by about 3%. For models which say it will have increased 200% by then from the present at that time, which is about 15 years ago, it would only increase by 197%, and this didn't seem horrifying. Benny Pizer recently spoke to Clintel, and he's long held that the only thing that will stop this issue is the pain imposed by the policies. Sri Lanka offers an example of this. There were restrictions placed on fertilizer because they were alleged to contribute to greenhouse gases. I have a little paper with Will Happer pointing out that these gases, N2O and methane, are, even though their molecules are very effective, there are so many fewer of them than CO2 that completely eliminating these gases would, at most, even in the most sensitive model, contribute a small fraction of a degree. But that doesn't stop the politicians, the control freaks. And in the case of Sri Lanka, the restrictions led to widespread starvation and an uprising. Now, in the US today, and coming to the end of the talk, President Trump, I think, has come up with a more benign approach. And it's typical, I think, of him. He's assembled a group. His Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, his administrator of the EPA, Lee Zeldin, and himself, all of them regard the warming hysteria and the demonization of CO2 to be baseless. I think, they all appreciate this is a political, not a scientific issue. And they're simply trying by fiat, executive order, and that's not always a permanent solution, but to eliminate all the regulations, funding, and institutions based on this hypothesis. And, so far, so good. A crucial start was getting rid of the endangerment finding, whereby greenhouse gases could be considered to be dangerous pollutants by the EPA. This action alone eliminated numerous EPA pointless but expensive regulations. There's also the Supreme Court rejection of the Chevron deference. That's very important because the Supreme Court in a previous case had decided that executive agencies like the EPA and so on should be deferred to because of their supposed expertise. And the Supreme Court has rejected that notion. The things have to be tried. Now, with everything I've mentioned, especially, what Chris Wright and Lee Zeldin are doing, there will be, and is already, heated and, of course, hysterical opposition. But I think they have been very successful in canceling the notion that climate alarm is truth. It's no longer canonical truth. And it's pretty much become, rather in America, and I don't know how it is in Ireland, but it's become a Democrat Republican thing. I think the Republican Party increasingly rejects climate alarm. There are exceptions, people who, you tell them 97% of scientists all agree, or as they did in 1988 on Newsweek, say all scientists agree. And they're frightened to question it, but that's being overcome, I think, by most Republicans. The damage that climate policies produced itself, as Pizer suggested, is diminishing the opposition and opening up a more honest and realistic view of the subject. Uh, you know, to paraphrase Niels Bohr, great physicist, prediction is very hard, especially when it deals with the future. But with the current administration in the United States, I think there's ample reason to hope for a saner view of climate and a better outcome for the world's people, those struggling with the increased cost of heating and driving, but especially for the billions who still lack adequate access to energy. I think it's sad that Ray has joined many of his colleagues who've died without seeing this denouement, but I suspect Ray never gave up hope that this day would come, and it can't come soon enough. Thank you.